Hello again, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Louisiana NOW podcast. I am your host, Todd Rossnagel. It is great to have you along with us. In this particular episode of the Louisiana NOW podcast, we are going to be focusing on annual conference. It is right around the corner, June 13th through the 16th in downtown Baton Rouge. For all of the information about annual conference, you can head to our website. It's la-umc.org. We'll leave a link to our website in the show notes of this episode. We can't wait to gather together as a family for annual conference. Again, June 13th through the 16th in downtown Baton Rouge. And as a way of getting us set for annual conference, in this particular episode of the Louisiana NOW podcast, we wanted to introduce you to one of our featured guest speakers. That person is Dr. Ashley Boggan, who is going to be joining us. She is the General Secretary of the General Commission on Archives and History, and she will be with us for the duration of our time together in downtown Baton Rouge for annual conference. And we thought we'd give you a preview of what she is going to be talking about and also give you a chance to meet Dr. Ashley Boggan, who joins us now from Madison, New Jersey. Ashley, thank you so much for carving time out of your schedule to be with us. We cannot wait to have you in Baton Rouge, and we cannot wait to share with you some of our famous Louisiana hospitality.
Thank you. I am very excited about coming down to Louisiana. The South holds a special place in my heart as an Arkansan, and so I am over the moon to be able to come and speak Methodist history to you all, and to actually get to spend the entire annual conference. That will also be quite a treat.
Well, it will be warmer than New Jersey, although sometimes it gets pretty hot in New Jersey.
New Jersey weather has been a bit strange of late. I like to say that this was the first winter I could tolerate because it was an Arkansas winter. Arkansas got more snow this year than New Jersey did the entire winter. So,
well, there you go. There you go. Well, as we mentioned off the top of the show, you are the General Secretary of the General Commission on Archives and History, and your role is described as ensuring that the UMC understands its past in order to envision a more equitable future. What exactly does that mean, Ashley?
So we at the General Commission, beyond kind of geeking out on history every day, which is one of my favorite parts of the job, and beyond kind of preserving the records of our denomination in our 6 miles of shelving that we house underground, we spent
I have to stop you there. 6 miles of shelving of just history and records? 6 miles?
Of linear shelving. So if you took each shelf and you lined it up, not like the full shelf, but each individual shelf. But yeah, 6 miles. I think
that's a lot of stuff.
We have a bunch of weird stats. If you stacked all of the paper that we preserve, it would be higher than like 5 or 6 Empire State Buildings or something like that. It gets wow. We care for a lot of history, and while the preservation of that history is one of our primary tasks, what we envision ourselves doing and how we contribute to the ministries and the connectionalism of the church is through pulling things off of that shelf, right? Using the material, interpreting it, making it available to scholars, to ministers, to seminarians, to laypersons, to non-United Methodists, so that they can see what we've done in our past in order to predict and help us envision where we should go. You cannot, or you should not, you probably can, but you should not talk about the future without a grounded understanding of what we've done in the past, or else we're bound to repeat it.
Well, that was one of my questions. We often talk about learning from our past, but practically speaking, sometimes looking at our past, especially a past that is as old as John Wesley, how do you balance the tension between something that is so old and balancing something that is as old as John Wesley and envisioning a future that is based in 2023, a future that I don't even think John Wesley could have imagined. How do you hold the tension between the two?
That might be where I thrive. I thrive in that
Mm.
tension. I thoroughly enjoy reading Wesley's words and looking at the context that he was writing in. Um, I often say that history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme.
Yeah.
And so when you look at like John Wesley, when he goes to Bristol, and y'all will hear this at annual conference. I'm not going to give it too much away, but you will hear about his time in Bristol at annual conference. Bristol in the 1730s, the late 1730s, wasn't that different from where we are, right? The trends of humanity are rather cyclical. Where we can interrupt history is how we respond. And so that's what I try to get across, that the way that religion and governments and people and societies and all of the ideologies that frame and create space for us to function in certain ways tend to repeat themselves. You could say this going all the way back to the BCE eras, right? But how we respond is why, one, we need to know that history and how we responded back then and what were the ramifications of our response. And two, that's where we are able to dream of new answers. When we have the same context or very similar contexts, you're able to use history to help you figure out, okay, we tried this. It didn't quite work the way that we thought we would, the way that we thought it would. What if we tried something like this? And so the answers aren't in the past, but the questions are. And so using your past to help you formulate better questions about not what do we do now in this moment for people right now, but what do we do now in this moment for people 50 years from now? Right? As
Great.
archivists, we hold, and as historians, we hold in tension that that balance of using things that are typical. Historians will say that history is anything that's 50 years or more older. I'm not a typical historian. I think that, this podcast, as we were recording it, is history kind of in the present moment. I don't mean that like in a conceited way. It's just, this is how my brain works. But so taking that history and then thinking, how is it going to be useful another 50 years from now? It can speak to the moment here, but it helps us craft questions that ensure our sustainability or that ensure our equitability for those in the future.
So give us an idea of how the past may have shaped something or transformed something in the United Methodist Church in maybe in our current setting.
So I would say that one of the more recent ways that we've used some of our more harmful stories from the past. In the last decade or so, we've really begun to try to create healing relationships with Indigenous communities here in the United States. A lot of that stems from I think it was an 1860s massacre in Sand Creek, which is part of what is now Colorado, where Methodists, I believe Reverend John Chivington, he rose to the level of a district. No, he was a minister, but he had the blessing of a district superintendent to go out to Colorado. And what was supposed to be a peaceful gathering of the Cheyenne and Arapaho persons to kind of live in and discuss a treaty that was being signed turned into a massacre of hundreds of persons, men, women, and children, led by Reverend Chivington. And he was Methodist. And the General Conference immediately following that massacre knew of it. They did not apologize for it or speak of it. They did not put Reverend Chivington on trial. They maintained their egregious statements against Indigenous persons and communities. And so in the late 90s, the late 1990s, there was a first overture to try to begin a mode of reconciliation with these indigenous nations. Unfortunately, the persons involved in that did not have all of their facts straight. And so it just did more harm. In 2012, General Conference and through different general agencies tried once again. And so we are now working towards those healing relationships, both at General Conference 2012 and 2016. I believe descendants from Sand Creek were present. We spent that quad from 2012 to 2016 investing in research. The book Massacre at Sand Creek, How American Methodists Were Involved in a Tragedy, was written and published and then released right before the 2016 General Conference, where it was received. And we got to apologize as a denomination to the descendants that were there. And all of the proceeds from that book go to support those descendants. Since 2016, with a little bit of a hiccup during the pandemic when just we couldn't be around each other, we couldn't travel, the Council of Bishops, different parties of the Council of Bishops, the General Commission on Archives and History, we've continued to nurture those relationships and try to find ways forward. And we're still doing that work. I mean, it's a few years ago when unmarked graves were found in Canada of Indigenous children who were in Indigenous boarding schools. We saw the discussion of particularly Christianity and Indigenous communities pick up in the media. And Archives and History had already been working with the Native American Healing Coalition for boarding schools prior to that. And so, but we are now doing a very intentional effort to research our involvement in Indigenous boarding schools, because it's the same mentality that led to Indigenous boarding schools that led to the Sand Creek Massacre. And so this is one of the ways that our history allows us to hold ourselves accountable to our past, especially if we didn't hold ourselves accountable in the past, in order to create better relationships now, in order to be better Christians ourselves now, not just to create better relationships, but to allow ourselves and our connection to acknowledge and to heal and to hopefully move forward towards that more equitable future.
Well, I think when we discuss the current state of the United Methodist Church, obviously one of the first things that comes to mind is our current season of disaffiliations and disaffiliating churches and the current pain surrounding disaffiliations. What comes to your mind when you can study history and look back at, one of the first things that comes to my mind is this is most certainly not the first time that there's been division inside the Methodist Church. But what are some things that come to your mind that we can learn from our past that could maybe be a guidepost for looking forward past our current season of disaffiliations?
So Methodists historically, and I don't mean this as a judgment, this is just a matter of fact, it's just a hard one to swallow. Right. Methodists historically are better at splitting than at staying together. The Methodist Episcopal Church kind of quote unquote officially begins in 1784 at the Christmas conference in Maryland. It has its first, what we might recognize today as a general conference in 1792. At that first general conference, there were two splits. Between 1792 and 1844, when I think most people think of 1844 as, the big split, where the Methodist Episcopal Church divided into a Southern church and then a predominantly Northern church over the issue of the institution of slavery. Between those two general conferences, there were approximately 12 to 14 splits. And looking at the reasons why those happened, and particularly the response of the Methodist Episcopal Church, or more specifically, its lack of response to why persons left, is an area where we can learn the most. Between 1830 and 1844 were some of the larger splits of white Methodists from the Methodist Episcopal Church, all over the continued allowance and tolerance of the Methodist Episcopal Church towards enslavers. And when you read the minutes of those general conferences and you hear the speeches of the persons who were leaving and the lack of a willingness to change when it came to the Methodist Episcopal Church, you kind of get it, right? Like there's this empathy that comes about of like, yeah, like the institution that we created and that we were cradling because it was growing so rapidly. We were terrified to budge on certain issues out of fear of losing more members, and our being scared and letting fear and numbers drive our mission and our ministry and our witness as Methodists, as particularly as Methodists who follow John Wesley, is what eventually led to just continued splits and splits and splits. And so now, right, when I think of us as United Methodists now, we have an opportunity, and it's one filled with hope. It really is. The Council of Bishops, are putting forth this Reclaim, Revive, Renew right now. And I love that idea. Because right now, yes, we are experiencing disaffiliation. We've experienced it in the past. The Methodist spirit survives. But the question is, what are we as United Methodists going to do? How are we going to respond? Are we going to stay the same and keep doing what we've been doing and just act like this was another group that just kind of left and we're not going to change? Or are we going to take this opportunity and look at, okay, this is probably like our 18th, 19th departure from this main trunk of Methodism. What are some of the ways and the areas that we might think to recraft ourselves, to reclaim our Wesleyan heritage, to revive our connectionalism, and to hopefully renew some of our polity, because our polity needs a lot of renewing right now. And so how do we use this moment to truly create history and to admit to ourselves that we don't always do and we aren't always structured right? And so there's a reason that persons leave. But we have that opportunity now to recraft ourselves into a new, hope-filled version of United Methodists, if we're brave enough to do it. Right? If we're brave enough to not let numbers drive the conversation, we can do it.
Yeah. Well, that's our theme for our annual conference, which is hope. And so I have a question about hope, but I'm gonna save that for my next question. But I wanted to maybe still stay or pull on this thread of going back in history and learning some things. In a video produced by the United Methodist Church, you said that John Wesley broke the rules of his institutional church because he recognized that the Spirit of God was moving in new ways, and sometimes this requires a bit of rule bending. Ashley, we as Americans, as humans, we don't like breaking the rules. We love following the rules. But this breaking of the rules, or this bending of the rules, that is really part of our history. I see that as very, very important in the days, months, years, and generations to come.
It really is. So this is one of those tensions that I think is very illustrative for where we are today and what we can learn from our past. So John Wesley was a minister within the Church of England. And he looked around and he saw that only certain persons came to the sanctuaries on Sunday. It was usually those who had the luxury of a day off, right? This is at a time when the concept of a weekend did not exist, right? That's one of those things that it's really hard to wrap our mind around, that you didn't get a day off from work unless you were of a certain class. And so that meant that only certain classes of persons were coming to sanctuaries. Back then, you wore your Sunday best, and not everybody had a Sunday best to wear if they did have the luxury. So the people that were coming to sanctuaries on Sunday morning were of a particular economic status. And Wesley kind of saw that they were really only coming on Sundays, that Christians in general weren't reaching the massive population of persons. And he was bold enough to critique that and begin a missional movement within the Church of England. When you look at John Wesley, he was not a systematic theologian, and I love and appreciate theologians, but I also thank John Wesley for not being a systematic theologian. But he was a systematic missiologist. He knew how to craft spaces for people to come together outside of the church walls and outside of Sunday morning, in spaces where they felt comfortable and seen and could be heard and could then feel worthy enough to be worthy of God.
Yeah.
Right. And so where he begins to kind of break some of those rules is, it was not forbidden to preach outside of the church walls on Sunday, but it was not something that you should do. Right. Yeah. So it was seen as weird, as peculiar. People would start kind of talking about you if you were doing that. And John Wesley didn't care. He was like, that's where the people are. And so that's where I feel God calling me. And you'll hear about this at annual conference in kind of more detail. But when he goes to Bristol, he not only speaks outdoors for the first time, but he speaks in another person's diocese. And that was outright forbidden. Especially, he did not let the minister know prior that he was coming, especially that it was coming and he was going to preach in the fields. And so that is where he starts to break rules. But he also sees the immediate effect of breaking those rules. I mean, thousands of people come to hear him. And Bristol was one of the towns that had the largest gap between the haves and the have-nots. It was the port of the Atlantic slave trade for England. I mean, there were people there that needed to hear that they were worthy of God's love. And Wesley decided that message was worth breaking the rules for. And from that moment in Bristol, he kind of gets this idea, this kind of renewed sense of call of what he's supposed to do. And that's to form a movement within the institution of the Church of England. Now, one of the luxuries that movements have is that they get to bend and break the rules because they don't set the rules. There is a very readily argument to be made that once the Methodist Episcopal Church kind of quote unquote officially formed in 1784, it tried to maintain that movement spirit. And it did for about 30 years. But then it started building brick churches. It started localizing ministry. It stopped being kind of the weird people on the American frontier religion, which we were. And I'll go into it again at annual conference. Methodists were weird and like wonderfully weird. I mean that in the best sense of the phrase. They upended social norm after social norm. They didn't drink. They didn't play cards. They didn't go to theater. They let men and women sit together. They let enslaved and not enslaved sit together. They let Black people preach. They let women preach. I mean, all of this was just anathema back then.
It almost, what comes to my mind, and kind of going back to Wesley, the spirit of Wesley, if you will, our theme for annual conference is hope,
Mhm.
right? And we've talked about that just here on our recording today. We've talked about hope. It would almost seem to me that it's impossible to do this. It's an impossible exercise. But if Wesley were to think about hope, it's almost that spirit of rule bending is nestled very, very close to the word hope.
Mhm.
In other words, the rule bending is what ushers in hope in some ways. Would that be accurate?
Yes, 100%. Because I think um, Wesley saw hope in those that God had touched, but that the institutional church had not yet reached.
Right. So the system hadn't reached those people. So the only way to do that was to bend the rules.
Yeah.
And we don't know what that looks like today. I mean, there's probably a lot of opinions out there about what that looks like, but we're in that the phrase today is we're in that wet cement, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And, today I don't know if we need to bend and break rules today. I mean, I am a rule bender, and I always say I like to poke bears. I get that spirit from my mother. But I think
I think the better phrase may be to reimagine, right?
yeah. Yeah. And, that really is what Wesley was doing. He was reimagining ministry, but in his context that required breaking rules. I don't want to get in the polity weeds on this podcast, but there might be some rules that need to be bended or broken.
Right.
But
I get it.
the heart of the message is, if you let numbers drive the conversation, and if you're only speaking to people who are sitting physically in a pew on Sunday morning, then you're not doing a hope-filled message.
Yeah.
So how do you reimagine ministry, which may require of you bending of some rules, in order to reach those that aren't there on Sunday?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the pet peeves about the disaffiliation conversation is and I know that it is painful and it requires grief and attention. I hear that. Please don't think that I'm not hearing that. But when it's numbers that we're focused on, we're losing sight of the potentiality of ministry that has always existed outside of the pews and outside of Sunday morning and Methodism. Like what I'm trying to get across to these annual conferences that I'll be going to is that this spirit of Wesley's bending the rules, or of, as you'll grow to love the word, being more vile, it originated with Wesley, and it never had a quote unquote official role in the institutional church. But Methodists throughout history have been vile. They have broken the rules to take the love of God out of the brick walls or the church walls on Sunday morning and empower those and love those that need it most. And that's what we need to reclaim, right? Like I'm not saying that, take the book of discipline and throw it out, or we need to completely redo everything, but
right.
We need to shift the conversation and focus on the ministries that are happening outside the walls and think about, okay, if that's where the Spirit of God is leading us, how do we redo ministry now, especially given the technology that we have for United Methodists for 100 years from now?
Ashley Boggan from New Jersey, who will be coming to Louisiana as one of our featured guest speakers. We cannot wait to hear from you, Ashley. I cannot wait to hear you unpack empowering a spirit of vileness, which I think is what you just said. I can't wait to hear from you. I've heard you speak before in a setting like this, and I know you do an amazing job. And so I can't wait to see you in Louisiana and to have you, and can't wait for our people to meet and greet you. Thank you so much for carving time out of what I know is a very busy schedule to join us here on the podcast.
Of course, and thank you, and I will see all of y'all in Baton Rouge.
Thanks again, Ashley. For everything that you need to know about Annual Conference 2023, you can head to our website. It's la-umc.org. We've got more information, a special video greetings from Bishop Dolores Williamston. A copy of this recording with Ashley Boggan is going to be on our website. Of course, the agenda, how to download the app, instructions for where to go and what to do. We even have suggestions on where you can eat in downtown Baton Rouge. It's all found on our website and on the Annual Conference app, and the information is on la-umc.org. For our producer, William Willoughby, I am your host, Todd Rossnagel. Thanks again for joining us here on the Louisiana Now podcast. Have a great day, everyone.